Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's webinar is an introduction to the Preventative Controls for Human Food rule for very small value-added food processors. Our speaker today is Dr. Stephanie Smith, who is with Washington State University. Stephanie is a consumer food safety specialist, and we're really happy to have her with us today. I'm Colette D. Phelps. I'm with University of Idaho Extension, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before Stephanie launches into her presentation, I just want to give you a couple of webinar tips. It could be helpful to you to close the other programs that are running on your computer so all of your computer's bandwidth can be dedicated to the webinar. If you are having some problems with sound, some clarity, speed, you can use the call-in number that's in the welcome email and call in on the telephone, and then you can mute your computer, and that way you'll be having very clear sound that is not dependent on your internet speed. If you are having any technical problems, please go ahead and type those into the chat box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring that box. If you have any questions for Stephanie, please type those into the question box that you will also see at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A, and we will stop partway through the webinar and at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you have. So again, technical assistance, go ahead and put that in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that. And then for any questions you have, you can type them in during the webinar, and then when we pause, we'll go ahead and answer those questions. I will be posting the handouts for this webinar on our website. I'll show you that URL at the end of the webinar. So don't worry about writing down everything on the slides. That information will be available to you later today. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand everything off to Stephanie, and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you for having me. And I want to thank you all for joining us as well today. If you were able to join us a couple of weeks ago when we talked about preventive controls for human food for growers, some of the information in this webinar will be the same, but we have expanded this webinar to provide some additional information. So today I'm going to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act and Preventive Controls for Human Food. We'll discuss some of the exemptions and requirements, and then go over the fundamentals of preventive control for human foods, including overview of a food safety plan and developing that plan, doing a hazard analysis, what are preventive controls and how to implement them. We'll talk about supply chain program, recall plans, changes to current good manufacturing practices, and employee training. So the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in 2011, and it's composed of 7 rules, which cover all aspects of growing, processing, holding, and packing of food, and even sanitary transport of food. The rule we're going to talk about today will be focused on preventive controls for human food. Ultimately, the Food Safety Modernization Act goal is to prevent food safety hazards across the entire food system and to take a more proactive approach to preventing hazards. The Food Safety Modernization Act allows the FDA to have more enforcement capabilities and ensure compliance with the regulations. So some of these include the rule mandates an inspection frequency. So FSMA establishes a mandated inspection of food facilities where all high-risk domestic facilities have to be inspected within 5 years of enactment of the rule and no less than every 3 years thereafter. During these inspections, FDA will have access to all records, including your food safety plan and any records regarding implementation of these plans. FSMA requires certain food testing to be carried out by accredited laboratories. And it also allows FDA the authority to issue a mandatory recall if the company refuses to issue one despite having a food safety hazard in the product. The rule also allows FDA to detain products that are in potential violation of the Food Safety Modernization Act, and allows FDA to suspend the registration of a facility if it determines that the food poses a hazard, a human health hazard. It also gives FDA the ability to track and trace domestic and imported foods, and also requires additional record keeping for high-risk foods. There's other aspects of the rule, including importer accountability, which means that importers are responsible to verify that their foreign suppliers have adequate preventive controls in place to make sure that the food products they're receiving are safe. And qualified third parties can certify foreign food facilities and ensure that they're in compliance with the U.S. food safety standards to help with entry of imports. The FDA also has the authority to require that high-risk imported foods are accompanied by credible third-party certification or other certifications of compliance. And FDA has established a voluntary program for importers so that there can be an expedited review and entry of those foods. And then also FDA can refuse entry into the U.S. From a foreign facility if that facility is questionable or is not complying with U.S. practices. So as you can see, a lot of the enforcement and compliance activities are quite extensive compared to what's been in in comparison to what's been part of the regulations in the past. So we're going to move on now to talking about the rule in a little more detail. So for preventive controls for human food, this applies if you manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food for consumption in the United States. Very large businesses needed to comply with this rule as of September 19th, 2016. Small businesses, which are considered those that have less than 500 full-time employees, needed to comply with the rule as of September 2017. And very small businesses, which are those averaging less than 1 million per year in annual sales, needed to be in compliance with the regulation as of September 2018. The dollar amount listed for very small businesses includes the market value of all food that's manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale. And this amount is also adjusted yearly for inflation. Qualified facilities are businesses with an average annual sales of less than $500,000, and at least half of the sales to consumers need to be to consumers, local retailers, restaurants, or an Indian reservation within the same state or within a 275-mile radius. Qualified facilities also include very small businesses. They're averaging less than 1 million, adjusted for inflation. And again, this includes both the sales of human food plus the market value of human food that's manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale. And this is over a 3-year, this dollar amount is over a 3-year period preceding the current calendar year. So these qualified facilities are exempted or have modified requirements for preventive controls for human food. So these businesses that have a qualified exemption requirements are still required to notify the FDA about their status and attest that they're either addressing identified hazards through the preventive controls and monitoring the preventive controls, or complying with applicable non-federal food safety regulations, and notifying consumers of the name, complete business address of the facility where the food was manufactured or processed. So for example, some cottage food industries might be exempted from the rule, but they would still need to submit notifications to the FDA and register the facility. As far as value-added processors that might also be a qualified exemption, have a qualified exemption based on sales, they would still need to submit these notifications to FDA and register the facility. So an otherwise qualified facility does not notify FDA by registering their facility is subject to the requirements for hazard analysis and preventive controls.
So can I jump in just for a second, Stephanie, and just get a little piece of clarity? So what I'm hearing here is that if you do not notify FDA about your status and attest that you're either addressing identified hazards through preventative controls and monitoring the preventative controls, or complying with applicable non-federal food safety regulations and notifying consumers of the name and complete business address of the facility where you're manufacturing or process your food, if you do not do those notifications, you are subject to the full rule.
That is correct.
Okay.
So you need to register your business. You need to register the business with FDA and attest that you are, complying with these applicable rules and notifying consumers of the name and complete business address of the facility.
Yeah, so thanks for clarifying that, because I think that
Yes.
that is one thing that is really key for people that are processing for these direct markets or intermediated markets, that they still do need to notify FDA and they do need to register.
Correct. And then another thing is to check with your local regulatory agencies as well. I know sometimes in Washington that there could be additional exemptions, for example, if you're a cottage food industry, because of the types of food being processed. So I definitely recommend that you check with your local regulatory agency as well.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, and additionally, even qualified exempted businesses have to follow conditions and practices for processing safe food under sanitary conditions. Excuse me. So these are known as current good manufacturing processes, and they cover personnel, maintenance of plants and grounds, sanitary operations, facilities and controls, equipment, processes and process controls, warehousing and distribution, and then holding and distribution of human food byproducts that are going to be used as animal food, and then defect action levels. So regardless, you still need to, even if you're qualified exempt, you have to comply with good, current good manufacturing processes. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss the overview of the requirements for preventive controls for human food. So preventive controls starts out by performing a hazard analysis, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. And then if a hazard's identified, a preventive control needs to be put into place to address that hazard. You need to have parameters and values to measure to ensure that your preventive control is working and that you're meeting the requirements to control that hazard. And you need to do monitoring. to ensure that your food safety plan is being followed and that your parameters and controls are working. If they're not, then you need to put into place a corrective action or other corrections, and then revisit doing a hazard analysis, your hazard analysis and your preventive controls, to see if changes need to be made to address those hazards. And throughout this entire process, there's verification and record keeping that needs to take place that shows what's being done. We always say if it wasn't recorded and documented, then it never occurred. So that's a very strong, a very important aspect of this program as well. Again, if you do identify a hazard during your hazard analysis, then you have to have a preventive controls in place and a food safety plan in place. And we'll talk a lot more about this as we go through the remainder of this webinar. So what is a food safety plan? A food safety plan is specific to a facility. So you cannot use a food safety plan for someone else's facility that might be producing a similar product or have a similar process. You need to develop your own food safety plan. You can group products together if the hazards and controls are generally the same. So, for example, if you're roasting almonds versus another tree nut, you might group those together, those products together in your food safety plan. Your food safety plan should define and address your specific product and processes, the parts of the food chain that need to be involved in your study, in your hazard analysis, and then also identify any biological, chemical, and physical hazards, which we'll discuss more in a moment. The contents of a food safety plan, there's useful contents and then there's the required contents. The required contents includes your hazard analysis, your preventive controls, which also includes a recall plan, and then your procedures for monitoring, corrective action, and verification. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, the hazard analysis, preventive controls, risk-based supply chain program, and recall plan are all required elements of the food safety plan, including your procedures for the monitoring, corrective actions, and verifications. What's useful to have in your food safety plan is an overview of the facility and a list of your food safety team describing who's responsible for what aspects of the food safety plan and their contact information. It's also very useful to have a detailed product description so you can understand, where the product's coming, have a detailed view of where the product's coming from, who your suppliers are, how it's being processed, and then also a flow diagram showing how the product may enter into where you're processing it, and the route it takes while it's inside that facility, and other information about the product while it's inside the facility. And then a detailed process description is also very useful. These 4 areas can be really helpful in developing your food safety plan because it helps you with identifying risks that the product may come across. The main organizational sections of your food safety plan include your background information, which I've discussed is optional but can be extremely helpful. It'll have your hazard analysis, your preventive controls, your recall plan, and your implementation procedures, so how you're going to implement your preventive controls. So I'm going to discuss in more detail the different aspects of the food safety plan. So the first aspect is the hazard analysis. So you must identify any known or reasonably foreseeable hazard. So for example, if you know your product is a potential risk for listeria, then your hazard analysis is going to identify that you need to control for listeria. You then, once you've identified the hazard, you have to determine if those hazards require a preventive control. So a hazard analysis is the process of collecting and evaluating information on the hazards and conditions leading to the hazards to determine which ones are going to be significant for food safety and need to be addressed in your food safety plan. So to further define a hazard is defined as any biological, chemical, including radiological or physical agent that has the potential to cause illness or injury. And a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard includes any of those three hazards that is known to be or has the potential to be associated with the facility or the food. So, for example, if there has been a recall or a foodborne illness outbreak caused by a particular pathogen with a particular food that you're also processing, then that is a known or potential hazard that you're going to have to address. And so it's really important to be aware of that. Again, that is also the same for any foreseeable hazards. So, for example, if you know that an imported product might have contaminants that could potentially cause a human health risk, then you're going to have to do something to address that hazard. So here's some examples of different types of hazard. So one of the ones we're most concerned with are biological hazards. And this includes bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. Bacteria by far cause the most illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths in the United States with regard to food safety hazards. And so this is something that definitely needs to be controlled within your process. Chemical hazard examples can include allergens, chemicals such as lead, arsenic, pesticides, and other residues, and then radiological hazards. And physical hazards that we see often can include glass pieces, rubber, metal, or plastic pieces, or even in, for example, something like dry peas, might be something like stones that could get into a food product. So these are all different examples of hazards. When evaluating your hazards, you should really look at the formulation of the food and the ingredients going into that food. Look at the condition, function, design of your facility and equipment. Do any aspects of your facility or equipment present a hazard? Look at the raw materials and ingredients and where they're coming from and what might be some potential hazards that are in those materials. Transportation practices are also an issue. For example, could a product that you're bringing, that you're buying during transport potentially become contaminated during the transportation? Could some of the processing procedures cause a hazard, or what processing procedures can be done to prevent the hazards? For example, if you do have a corrective action in place, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and that product, you do have corrective actions in place and you've identified a hazard that you're controlling for through preventive controls, but something's happened where that hazard hasn't been controlled properly during the process, some of the things you could potentially do is rework the product. So that's something that you should consider as a potential corrective action. Packaging and labeling activities are other hazard evaluations. We'll talk more about allergens in a minute, but a lot of times we see product recalls because a product contains an allergen but wasn't labeled as containing that allergen, and that results in a big recall. You should look at your storage and distribution. The intended or reasonably foreseeable use of that product, that's come up a lot, especially we see that a lot with frozen products. So for example, if you are growing peas and then flash freezing, processing them and flash freezing them to be used in a product, generally those peas have not undergone a preventive control, and they're not expected to be consumed without cooking first. But consumers often use those peas in salads and mix them in while they're still in their frozen state. So this can potentially cause a risk for listeria. So that would be an example where you know a consumer is using a product in a certain way that might be risky, and so you need to address that risk. And then also consider sanitation, including employee hygiene practices, and then any other relevant factors. When you're doing your hazard analysis, you really need to consider the likelihood of something occurring and of other risk factors. So for example, data from past foodborne illness outbreaks, especially those that are associated with a product similar to yours, is going to be important. And any recall data from similar products, you should be looking at those to help evaluate your hazards. Information from the scientific literature should be looked at, and then also historical information in the establishment. So this would be more with larger businesses, but that might be producing multiple products, but this could also apply to very small businesses as well. You know, what are the different products coming through? What have you processed there before, and what might be some hazards that still exist? There's a lot of regulatory guidance that can help you, as well as any trade associations. And then, of course, University Extension has plenty of resources available to help you as well. We're now going to move on to discussing the preventive controls aspect. So once you've completed your hazard analysis, if you identify a hazard, then you have to put a preventive control into place to significantly minimize or prevent the hazard from occurring. So preventive controls may include your process controls, allergen controls, sanitation controls, or other controls as needed. And we will discuss each of these 4 preventive controls in a little more detail. So some examples of process controls are below or on the slide in front of you. So biological process controls could be process controls that kill pathogens. So for example, cooking the product to the correct temperature required for the correct length of time to kill microorganisms. You can have process controls in place that might prevent growth. So using refrigeration or freezing to slow the growth of organisms, acidifying a product to inhibit microbial growth in the product, reducing the water activity to also inhibit microbial growth in the product. You might put into place some supply chain programs, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, or even have expanded sanitation controls to control for any biological hazards. For chemical process controls, you might include supply chain programs and sanitation controls. You might dedicate equipment to help prevent any chemical contamination from occurring. Allergen labeling might be something that's very important, and then ingredient testing. For physical process controls, some examples that are in place might be use of metal detectors, especially if you have a lot of metal equipment or are using a lot, or if metal's involved in the process in some way, such as cutting up a food, or using x-rays or even filters to make sure that there aren't any physical contaminants in your food. Your process controls must have parameters, including your minimum and maximum values. So for example, if you're using time and temperature control, you might say that the product has to have an internal temperature within a range of 160 to 165 degrees for a minimum of 30 seconds to meet the parameters for your process control. There needs to be monitoring. So an example of this is checking the product temperature on 10% of the products using a calibrated thermometer. Excuse me. Corrective actions might be if something is out of range, maybe you're going to adjust the equipment cooking temperature and rework or reprocess that product. You need to be using verified and validated processes. So you need to verify, for example, that corrective action worked, and you need to be using validated processes to ensure that your preventive control and your process controls are working. And then you need to maintain records. So an example might be any reprocessing records, thermometer calibration records, product temperature logs. These types of records will need to be generated and maintained. And food allergen controls is another process control. So these are the procedures, practices, and processes to control allergen cross-contamination and or cross-contact and ensure proper labeling. Food allergen controls must have monitoring. So for example, you might need to do monitoring to check that the correct labels are being applied, that the correct dedicated equipment is being used, or that there's appropriate cleaning for the allergen removal, for example. You need to have corrective actions in place. So for example, if the wrong label was used on the product, what's your corrective action going to be? You might relabel the product or destroy or divert the contaminated product. There needs to be verification in place. So for example, verifying that corrective action worked, or that the correct labels were applied in the first place. And then you need to be maintaining records. So for example, if you have a deviation and a corrective action was applied, then you would want records of that occurring. It's also important to know that there are 8 allergens. They're considered the big 8, and these cause approximately 90% of all allergic reactions. So these need to be labeled on the product. And as I already mentioned, failure to label allergens properly on a product is responsible for a large number of recalls every year. So these big 8 allergens include milk, soy, tree nuts, shellfish, wheat, peanuts, eggs, and fish. I'm now going to discuss sanitation controls. These are procedures, practices, and processes to ensure a facility is maintained in a sanitary manner to control a hazard that has been identified. Also, with sanitation controls, you need to be doing monitoring. So for example, if you need to control for listeria, your monitoring might include practicing a regular swabbing protocol to detect listeria species that might be in your facility, or to make sure that you're preventing listeria from entering your facility. You need to have corrective actions in place. So for example, if you have a positive result, what's your corrective action going to be? Maybe you need to hold on to the product for microbial testing or do re-cleaning and sanitizing of the equipment. You need to do verification, so ensuring that you're testing for the right organisms that need to be tested for. If you get a positive result, maybe you need to do retesting to verify that your corrective action was sufficient enough to take care of the problem. And then you need to maintain records. So some examples of records could include environmental monitoring records, test results, or any corrective actions applied. We're now going to move on to talking about risk-based supply chain program. So if a hazard's related to ingredients from a supplier and you are dependent on that supplier to control the hazard that's been identified, then you must have and implement a supply chain program and perform verification. So basically, if you're getting in, say you're getting in a product that you're gonna use as an ingredient, such as raw tree nuts, and those are a potential risk for salmonella, but you're dependent on the supplier to control that hazard of potentially being contaminated with salmonella, then you have to have and implement a supply chain program and verify that your supplier is controlling the salmonella risk. So in the risk-based supply chain, you must use approved suppliers. You need to determine which needed supplier verification activities are needed. For example, performing on-site audits, doing sampling or testing of the materials to ensure that the materials are safe and won't cause a hazard, and potentially reviewing suppliers' records, such as their testing records and processing or inspection or audit records. You need to conduct supplier verification, and you need to have documentation, such as any copies of records that they have verifying that they have controlled for that hazard, copies of laboratory test results, sampling and testing dates, times, and the product type and lot number, and any audit records. So you need to have documentation that that hazard is being controlled for by the supplier and that they're meeting the requirements. I'm now going to move on to talking about a recall plan. So again, if the hazard analysis has identified a hazard for which you have need to have a preventive control or preventive controls in place, then you must also have a written recall plan as part of your overall food safety plan. This recall plan must include procedures for conducting a recall, the steps to perform the recall, and the assignment of responsibilities for different aspects of the recall. The recall plan steps should include notification to regulators, and it's important to have your regulatory agency contact information available, and you should include this as part of your inside your food safety plan so it's readily accessible. You need to notify any receivers of your product of the recall and have a method to do that. You'll need to make a determination of the disposition of the affected food. For example, do you want to have the person receiving your food destroy it, or do you want that product back so that you know how much of the product might still be out in the market? You need to have a way to notify the public, and you can make a determination ahead of time as to how you're going to do this and who your contacts are going to be and how you're going to go about that. And then again, it's going to be important to verify your recall effectiveness. So is the information getting out to who it needs to get out to? Have the proper people been contacted, including your receivers and the regulators and the public? And have you been able to to get the affected product back or ensure it's been destroyed properly. I'm going to move on now to talking about resources for preparing a food safety plan. So some of the resources might include personnel such as consultants, auditors, employees, process authorities, or suppliers. People that have experience in preparing food safety plans can be very helpful to work with to prepare your own food safety plan. There's a lot of reliable internet sources available, including the FDA website, the FSPCA website, and other government agency websites. And also extension websites as well can be very helpful. There's a lot of publications that might be useful, including peer-reviewed literature. So you should be looking at peer-reviewed literature when you are trying to determine your hazards and put proper preventive controls into place. FDA publications and guidance documents can be helpful, and then also trade association publications. Again, Extension's here to help you with this, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you need assistance. One thing I wish to make a note of is that the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule requires that there is a Preventive Controls qualified individual that oversees the plan and prepares the food safety plan. So what is a Preventive Controls qualified individual? It is an individual who has successfully completed training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls. And according to the regulation, the training must be at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum. So right now that standardized curriculum is FSPCA's Preventive Controls for Human Food course, which is a 2.5-day training, and Extension offers this course. So don't be afraid to reach out to us if you think you might need this course. Additionally, somebody can be qualified through job experience to develop and apply a food safety system, but you're going to have documentation of that job experience and that person has enough experience to actually prepare and oversee a food safety plan. Another aspect of preventive controls for human food is that there are some updated GMP requirements. So for training, employees must be qualified to not only perform their assigned duties, but they also need to be trained in the principles of food hygiene and safety. And you need to maintain these training records that show who was trained, the topic that was covered, and on what date that training occurred. There's also updated requirements for allergen cross-contact controls. So you need to have practices and procedures in place to control allergen cross-contact. And there's also new provisions for holding and distribution of food byproducts used for animal food. So in summary, the Preventive Controls for Human Food covers the manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of human food. All facilities should already be in compliance if they're not exempt. And your extension in your state agricultural department can help you determine if you're exempt or covered under the rule. Even if if you have a qualified exemption, you still must register with FDA. You must follow current good manufacturing processes. You should be keeping paperwork showing sales and other records that prove your exemption. And you still need to label food with the name and the complete business address of the facility where that food was produced or processed. If you are covered, You must have a preventive controls qualified individual to oversee your food safety plan. And we highly recommend just taking the standardized training, because you get a certificate and you get to go through the process of um, practicing to develop food safety plans. So we do highly recommend the standardized training to meet this requirement. And last but not least, there's many resources available, so please don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. Here's some information on additional resources that are available. So you can Google FDA Food Safety Modernization Act or FDA Preventive Controls for human food, and you'll get a lot of resources listed on their website. Also, WSU's food processing website can help, as well as University of Idaho's website on the Food Safety Modernization Act and the PNW Food Safety website. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Colette.
Okay, great. I'm just going to give our listeners and viewers today a couple minutes to go ahead and type in any questions that you might have. And while they're deciding if they have any questions that they would like to ask Stephanie, I just wanted to briefly go over again that if you go to the PNW Food Safety website, you can see the link here at the bottom of the page. You'll be able to see the recordings from today's webinar and past webinars. So the introduction to preventative controls for human food that was recorded on May 20th. If you are doing any of this food processing on your farm, or if you have a farm, you will want to review that webinar because it has some things that are specifically related to farms and preventative controls for human food. And those things were not necessarily covered within this webinar. So there are specific things if you are a farm and you want to go ahead and watch that May 20th recording. With that, I don't see that we have any questions that have come in. So I want to thank you so much, Stephanie, for today's webinar, walking us through those different processes, talking about what it means to be a qualified facility. And for those of you that are watching today, we have a couple of upcoming webinars. Our next one in this food safety series is Compost Happens, Managing Food Safety Risks in Biological Soil Amendments. That's going to be next week on Tuesday, June 11th. And then following that, we will have a webinar really looking at food safety for safe and wholesome foods. That's June 17th. Again, we thank you for joining us today and hope that you have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.